Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jay's Fifth Down podcast. I'm your host Jay, and here today with Shehan Jeyarajah. Thank you for coming on with us, man. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, man. So crazy weekend of college football here, and the semifinal games: Georgia and Ohio State, of course, and TCU and Michigan. So first, let's recap TCU and Michigan, man. Obviously the Frogs got the win there, and they're going to be going to the national championship game to face Georgia. So, after watching that game, man, what's your reactions? And how did TCU get that victory against a talented Michigan team?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I feel like I was one of the few people in the country who did pick TCU to win that game. And, the reason that I did that, I thought that, looking back at some of Michigan's other games, the game against Purdue, the game against Maryland, and certainly the game against Ohio State, there were some advantages that I felt like TCU could take advantage of. One thing for me was, Michigan had not faced off against very many kind of dynamic pass offenses, teams that are really trying to spread you out. And when they did, you really look at that game, especially against Purdue, where Charlie Jones went 10 catches for 162 yards. And certainly that Ohio State game where they allowed a pair of 100-yard receivers. And you felt like Quentin Johnston might be able to do something for TCU. And obviously he had a big game, a really game-changing touchdown for TCU. So, I felt like it was a pretty good matchup. I felt like this was a team that kind of was able to spread out Michigan just a little bit more than normal. And the other part of it, too, was that when I compared them to somebody like Purdue or to somebody like Ohio State, they are a much better team at converting in the red zone. I thought that they'd be able to turn some of those short field opportunities into touchdowns. And ultimately, certainly I think you have to look at what they did on the defensive side of the ball with the pick sixes and also just kind of containing that running game. But ultimately, I do think that taking advantage of those opportunities in the red zone, taking advantage on third down was such a huge part of what TCU was able to do and how they won that game.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Just they have been a physical team all year long, and I think like you said, it was a great matchup because Michigan, what they like to do, running the ball, and just how they were able to contain, and just McCarthy wasn't really able to get a lot going through the air, not until really late in the game anyway, and so they get the win, man, with the 13-1 on the year, and they play Georgia in the national championship game. So before we get to that, though, we're gonna move on to the Peach Bowl with Georgia and Ohio State. Of course, Georgia getting the win 42-41, just narrowly by a missed field goal attempt. So, what were your thoughts on this game, man? And how Ohio State they were competing the whole game, man, but they couldn't get the win. So, what were your initial reactions to this contest?
Well, I think that for me, I feel like we've been waiting for the Georgia versus Ohio State game for really like the last 2 or 3 years, right? Because we've seen Georgia turn into this defensive dynasty. Obviously, through the first 10 games of the season, they were just absolutely unstoppable defensively. But we haven't necessarily seen, since that game against Alabama in the SEC title game last year, we haven't seen an offense that's built to go over the top of them. And I think that Ohio State proved, it is possible to get behind them. Obviously with Georgia, they lost some key players to the 2022 NFL draft, especially on that back end. And for however talented Keely Ringo is, he's a sophomore. And however talented Malachi Starks is, he's a freshman. And we saw those moments kind of come to the forefront really until Marvin Harrison Jr. got hurt for Ohio State. And so, I think that for me, I was curious about whether Georgia would be able to kind of bulldoze them offensively, whether they'd be able to really get at them in between the tackles. But that didn't really happen. Georgia had a good game offensively, but it really was kind of explosive passing plays that they were able to kind of pull this thing off. I think that certainly, Georgia deserved to win the football game, but I think Ohio State was the better team on that day. And Georgia kind of just made the big plays in the right moments and obviously benefited from the fact that that Ohio State missed that late field goal. So incredibly exciting game. It certainly, I think, has to go down as one of the best games in the history of the college football playoff. And Georgia's back with a chance to now win its second national championship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a great game. And Stetson Bennett, of course, you mentioned that offense. We've seen Georgia be that defensive juggernaut and physical. They're going to wear you down, get after you. They got that great defensive front, and the back end, however, was a question mark, especially after the LSU game where they did give up a lot of yards, in garbage time. But, and so, yeah, I mean, they had a great game. Stetson Bennett, 23 of 34, 298 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 pick, and Arian Smith, however, had a great game, 3 receptions, 129 yards, and a touchdown. So he was very key. What do you, how do you believe that Ohio State was still able to stay so close within to Georgia within the game? How were they able to attack that defense, do you believe?
Yeah, well, I think that, the big thing is that the question that I had about C.J. Stroud heading into the playoff and really after 2 years was, when things break down, does he have the ability to make things happen? And I think that in this game more than any other over the last 2 years, he proved that he can, right? I mean, we saw that incredible touchdown pass down the field that he had early in the game. We saw even on that last drive of the game, him kind of break away for a 29-yard run that set up that field goal that really could have won the game. I think that this is what you have to do against Georgia. You have to take advantage of those moments, of those opportunities, of those lapses. And certainly C.J. Stroud, I think, played one of the best games of his career. And most teams don't have a quarterback like that who's going to be picked in the top 5 of the NFL draft. And so I think that that's such a huge part of it, is just they were able to kind of go downfield and make Georgia think. That's one of the big things too, right? I mean, you have these situations where you've got these crossing routes where, Georgia defenders are having to sit back and be like, wait, who takes who, right? And I think that these are the moments that you have to have in order to challenge a defense like Georgia that's obviously so good up front. You kind of have to take the game out of the front's hands, and you have to put it on that back end. So I think Ohio State did a great job of that. I think that they're one of the few teams in the country that kind of could abandon the running game just because of what they have at receiver, and they were able to attack at all 3 levels in the receiving game, and I think that was absolutely huge when going against a defense that obviously is known for making plays at all 3 levels.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. As you said, Marvin Harrison Jr., before he left the game, 5 receptions, 106 yards, 2 touchdowns. And I think a lot of people in the country believe that if he had not exited that game, we might be talking about something different here. And so I think you and I both can agree on that because they couldn't stop him. And so it was just, they couldn't cover him, and Stroud was looking for him early in the game, and I told people that he was going to be the X factor for this game. They have to get the ball into Marvin Harrison Jr.'s hands, and they did it early. But once he left the game, other than I believe his name was Ekbuga, something like that.
Yeah,
he had a good game too. But other than that, they didn't really have any outside help at the receiver position. So, of course, it's just one-on-one matchups, because, when you have a guy like Harrison in there, he's going to draw so much attention. And, you're leaving those other guys out there one-on-one. So, of course, that's a huge loss to your offense. So, but yeah, Ohio State just, 1 point, man, they just missed by 1 kick. So, if you're Ohio State looking forward into next season, what are the what do you have to look forward to? What are some things you can build off of here? Some momentum going into next season.
Yeah, well, I think that, it's funny. We kind of made this comparison on my podcast, College Football Survivor Show, right? When we were heading into that last week of the season, that conference championship weekend, you look at where Ohio State was, and you look at where, for example, USC was, right? Like, they felt like 2 programs heading in opposite directions. Well, I think that Ohio State now, this opportunity to play against Georgia, this opportunity to compete and getting to go off, not on a win, but on a really good performance, I think really does make you feel a lot better than coming off of that loss versus Michigan, right? Because I think that you do, obviously you're going to lose C.J. Stroud to the NFL draft, but there's going to be a whole lot of talent coming back. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be back. Emeka Egbuka is going to be back. Travion Henderson's going to be back. They have some really good players on the offensive line. JT Tuimoloau on the defensive line is going to, I think, potentially be the best defense player in the country next year. He has been unbelievable in the second half of the season. And you expect that with a couple years heading into your second year under defensive coordinator Jim Knowles, this unit's going to get a lot better as well. We saw that at Oklahoma State, that the first year was a little bit dicey, and then the second, third, fourth year started to become incredible units. So I think you have to feel pretty good about where Ohio State's at. Obviously, at receiver, I mean, they're like a factory out there with the way that they recruit those receivers and the system that they have. Certainly, a lot's going to be on the shoulders of likely starting quarterback Kyle McCord, but he was a 5-star prospect as well coming out of high school. He's a talented player, and so I think that they just kind of have to figure out that quarterback position. But certainly that's been where Ryan Day's been at its best.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, that they got some great players on both sides of the ball, especially offensively with Henderson, who was out in that game. So that was another loss for Ohio State. So just the fact they were able to compete so well without those key players that they had on offense, Jackson Smith and Jiba as well, not on the field. So it's just I was really impressed by Ryan Day's team and the way they fought, the way they competed, and the game plan that they had. Just of course things happen, missed field goals, things like that happen. So, but that shifts us forward to the national championship game, which will be at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, California, 7:30 Eastern Time on ESPN, Georgia and TCU. So, Shehan, what are you looking forward to in this matchup here, and what's going to be key for both teams to get a win here in the national championship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a really good game. The line is the biggest line that we've seen since 2002, right? It's a 13-point line. But, Ohio State was a double-digit underdog in that 2002 game against the 2002 Miami Hurricanes, and they ended up pulling the upset and winning that game and winning their first national championship in 30 years. So we haven't had necessarily a moment where a team has come in as a huge favorite and then just steamrolled the team, right? I mean, usually these national championship games tend to be pretty competitive. And so I think it's going to be a good matchup. Obviously, on the TCU side, you're looking at Max Duggan, you're looking at what Quentin Johnson can do at receiver. And I think that you have to be wondering, look, can you keep that Georgia pass rush away from Max Duggan and create opportunities downfield? TCU does have the receivers to be able to do it. Quentin Johnson, Savion Williams, Darius Davis, Tay Barber would be another guy. Like, they have to get behind, I think, that Georgia defense and make them think. And on the other end, I think the biggest question for TCU is going to be, what do you do with Brock Bowers? Because I think that, Brock Bowers is the best tight end in the country. We're kind of waiting to see whether Darnell Washington will play. He suffered an ankle sprain, but I would expect him to play. I mean, it's a national title game. If you're able to go, then you're going to go. And so certainly that's, I think, probably the most unstoppable tight end duo in college football that we've seen for a very long time. I mean, you probably have to go back to that Iowa team that had TJ Hawkinson and Noah Fant on it back in 2015 or so. So, I mean, I don't think that TCU has a defender who is built to keep up with that kind of tight end. But, I think that the same thing goes the other way. I think that TCU has the ability to be dynamic, to get outside, to create opportunities and mismatches, even against Georgia's good cornerback. So it could be a back and forth game. I'm most curious to see. Look, we saw TCU win the physical battle up front on both sides against Michigan, a very physical team. Can they at least compete with Georgia from that perspective? Because if they can, I think this could be a very competitive game.
Yeah, like you mentioned, just being able to compete in the trenches, right? Offensively, defensively, on the offensive line and the defensive line, and I think that's going to be that is where these teams are very similar. They're very physical, and they can get after you, and the question is, it was going into that game against Michigan, could they match that physicality, right? They were hearing it all week, and even Max Duggan said, we kept hearing all week, like, are they going to be physical and this or that? Michigan, they're just big, physical team, like to run the football, and not to get after you, but he's like, hey, you know what, we can do that too, and they did it. So, that's what I'm looking forward to as well. I think it's going to be a very good game, as far as just how these teams match up with each other, and like you said, Darnell Washington, we're waiting to see the reports on him and see if he'll play or not, but most likely, if he can, he will, as you said. So, who would you say are the X factors for both teams in this matchup here?
Yeah, so I think on the Georgia side, I mean, I think that you do have to look at Brock Bowers. I think that you just have to see, can he create mismatches? So much of what Todd Monken does at offensive coordinator for Georgia is predicated being able to use those tight ends because they are such mismatches. You can put them anywhere on the field. We've even seen them obviously run stuff like sweeps to Brock Bowers. We've seen them go down the field. We see them in the short passing game. So much of the team is, I think, predicated on that. And so I think that's going to be a huge matchup that I really think will ultimately potentially end up decide the game. And on the TCU side, I'm going to be really looking at that interior offensive line. They've got an All-American at left guard in Steve Avila, and at center, they've got a fifth-year senior in Alana Lee, who was a transfer from SMU who's going to play in the NFL. So you have a great combination of guys there, but they've never seen anything like Jalen Carter before. And so I'm going to be curious to kind of see, look, can you keep him at bay enough? We saw, Jalen Carter didn't look 100% when he was playing against Ohio State, and I think that if they can kind of keep a hobbled Jalen Carter to a little less than what he's used to, I think it's going to be critical that TCU find the ability to run the ball in this ball game. They're not necessarily a between the tackles team, but, can you get outside? Can you spring guys free? Can you also involve some of that quarterback run game with Max Duggan? I think it's going to be huge. Obviously, in that win against Michigan, they rushed for 263 yards and had a 62% success rate running the ball. They're going to have to be a productive and consistent rushing team against this Georgia defense. And this Georgia defense is one of the best run defenses we've ever seen. So that's going to be, I think, a huge battle for them is that interior line versus Jalen Carter. And then on the other side, Brock Bowers versus whoever TCU tries to line up against him at linebacker.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a game of those matchups, and like you said, Brock Bowers just an athletic freak at the tight end position. I mean, we haven't seen, like you said, something like him. I would say maybe Gronk, right? Or somebody like that,
right.
Even Kyle Pitts a few years ago. So, as far as just that mismatch at that position, so both of those guys, of course, in the league right now. But, yeah, man, so I think, it's going to be a good game. And I think, it's a lot of people don't understand this too, man, when you have a quarterback out there like who has set the tone for the team, like, hey, we don't care who we're playing on their side, we're gonna go and we're gonna win this game. Guys rally behind that type of guy, and I think Max Duggan is that guy for TCU. He's that guy, and Sonny Dykes coming in his first year taking his team to the national championship. Man, I mean, it's crazy how they've done it, but they have done it. So that's gonna be a huge game. So, like I said, we look forward to that game again on ESPN next Monday night in SoFi Stadium. So, Shehan, what would you say, man, are your sleeper teams heading into the 2023 season? Of course, I mean, we've had the transfer portal and all this and that. We talked about the last couple of years, how that's impacted the game and these coaches moving around. So, who you say are some teams to just keep an eye on moving into next season?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one team that I think really upped their stock this year was Washington. Obviously, Kalen DeBoer in his first season took them back to 10, 11 wins for the first time in a while. And actually, if they don't lose a bizarre game to Arizona State in an interim coach squad, then they're playing for the Pac-12 championship against USC, and Utah's not even there. So, I mean, Washington, they're going to bring back Michael Penix. They're going to bring back a couple of their great receivers. I think they're going to be even better on the defensive side of the ball. They're a team that I think could be right on the edge of the college football playoff discussion. Now, can they get there? That's obviously, we haven't seen a team from the Pac-12 make the college football playoff since 2016, but that team was Washington, the last team to do it. So I think that they do potentially have an opportunity to be pretty special. I feel like it's not a sleeper at this point, but I really like what Tennessee is doing out there. I think that they're only going to continue to get better. They had an opportunity until that bizarre South Carolina game to potentially be the team that got in at number 4. If they don't lose that game, I think that maybe they're in the playoff instead of Ohio State. Obviously, it's going to be a big difference having Joe Milton instead of Hendon Hooker, who I think is just a little bit more of a versatile quarterback maybe than Milton. But I think they're going to continue to get better. They've done a great job of leveraging, NIL and transfer portal and recruiting in order to kind of get a roster that I think is going to be deep enough to compete. So I think that Tennessee is definitely a program that you have to look at on the way up. And one other one that I'll throw out there as well is I think that next year might be the year that Penn State pops a little bit. They obviously won the Rose Bowl this year. They won 11 games. I don't want to act like they were at nobody all season long, but you look at what their running backs were doing at the end of the season, and Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. I mean, this is the best running back duo in the entire country. I expect them to be a top 10 rushing offense next year. And I think that they have an opportunity if that defense can maintain. And if Drew Aller at quarterback, a former 5-star, can kind of be the answer there, they have a chance to kind of put some things together and be a really special team that maybe can even compete next year with Ohio State and Michigan.
Yeah, most definitely. I think those are some teams that, definitely could make it back. And we saw Tennessee, that amazing offense that they had this year. Of course, you're going to lose Hendon Hooker to the draft, and and I believe, I'm not sure if Hyatt is coming back this year.
He's gone too. Yeah, he's gone too.
So he's gone too. Those are some key players you're losing. But again, I like what Josh Heupel's done there and what he's building at Tennessee. So now my next question for you is, man, now Alabama, of course. Everybody, the big question was, you see my shirt. What was going on with them this year? And it wasn't there for them this year. So can they get back on track next year? I mean, you losing Bryce Young, Will Anderson to the draft. Some key players on defense as well. Jordan Battle, Brian Branch. So I mean, what's going to be key for Alabama to get back to Alabama football next year?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I mean it's funny, right? Obviously, most programs would kill for the opportunity for their bad seasons to be finishing number 5 and winning a major bowl game. But this year, you look at a lot of numbers, you look at a lot of stats, you look at obviously their results. I mean, you could make the case that this is the worst Alabama season we've seen since 2010, right? Like it's that's the standard at Alabama is that high, right? And so. It's the funniest thing about all of this, and honestly, we could do a whole other podcast on just this. But it was so strange to see Alabama kind of reach some lows in the years where they had the best quarterback they've ever had. I mean, Bryce Young is going to be probably the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. But the thing that I've been curious about, and I feel like this kind of factored in whenever Jalen Milroe was starting for them for a couple games, is if you are an offense, and if you're a defender, honestly, too, do you feel like just all the time Bryce Young can bail you out, right? Like, I wonder how much that impacts the psyche of a team to maybe to a fault feel like you're never out of games. And so the thing I'm going to be curious about with Alabama is, can they be more balanced next year, right? They've been so pass dependent for the past couple of years. I think they're going to try to balance things out on the offensive side just a little bit more, which is something that I think they can do. And the other thing too, probably the biggest personnel issue I'm going to be keeping an eye on is, are they going to get back to kind of developing these massive defensive linemen, right? We haven't seen that for a couple of years. Jaheim Otis is somebody who I really like to maybe turn into that kind of guy in the next couple of years. But, we used to see, right, they would just continuously put these guys out, the Jonathan Allens, the Fedarian Mathis, all these sort of guys who are such hosses in the middle of the line. It didn't feel like they had that this year, and really didn't feel like they had it last year either. So, I think that they need to get a little bit more bulky up front. I'm curious, again, something else that I'm going to be looking into this offseason is, with NIL and the transfer portal, like how much of this is Georgia coming in and taking guys who would have gone to Alabama before? How much of this is Texas A&M taking defensive linemen who would have gone to Alabama before? So I know that Nick Saban is the most versatile coach in the history of college football. I know he's going to figure out exactly what the plan is, but I think that they need to get a little bit bulkier there, and I think they need to do just a little bit of a better job developing these guys into true first-round talents like we used to see year in and year out at Alabama.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, and like you said, finding that balance, right, offensively. And like I said, they've been pass dependent the past couple of years. Bryce Young and Tua, Mac Jones, all those guys, great passers, and of course, 2 of them are already in the NFL doing a great job with their respective teams there. And Bryce will be, up next, so as he's already declared. So, it's interesting. It's interesting to see what's going to happen with that quarterback position, and who's going to step up there for them. Will they start leaning more towards the run? Because they weren't able to run the ball as well as they wanted to this past season. And so that's going to be key for me. And defensively, it's going to be, of course, can they get that back end together? I think that was a lot of struggles in the secondary this year for Alabama. That was something that they had a lot of issues with, and a lot of fans were wanting Pete Golding to get fired and Bill O'Brien to get fired. So, so for the coordinators there, so yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they do that, man. And like NIL and transfer portal, those are all going to play a role into how that goes, especially if Georgia is to repeat as national champions this year. So, but yes, it's going to be college football is always it's just the parody, man. You never know what's going to happen. It's just crazy, and that's why we love it, right?
No doubt about it.
Yes. So, but yeah, like I said, man, yeah, thank you for coming on, Shehan. We appreciate your time and talking some college football with us, recapping Georgia and Ohio State, of course, and TCU and Michigan, and then looking forward to the national championship with Georgia and TCU. Again, you guys can catch that game next Monday night on ESPN 7:30 kickoff time at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles. So, Shehan, yeah, tell us where we can find your podcast that you have, and what you guys have going on over there.
Yeah, well, of course, you can find all my work at cbssports.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Shehan Jeyarajah. And so you can also subscribe to the College Football Survivor Show. It's on every podcast platform. Basically, the premise of the show is we talk playoff all year long, but also in the context of the dynamics affecting college football. Also, in terms of obviously playoff expansion has been a huge topic of conversation for us. So it's a 365-day a year, conversation about the state of the playoffs. So make sure and check that out on any podcast platform.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, man, for that. And again, this has been the Jay Smith Down Podcast. Of course, you guys can find us here on YouTube and every other podcast platform as well. Also on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, wherever you can find us at there. And we have Shehan Jeyarajah here from CBS, and also you guys check out his podcast. Thank you, man, for your time, and you have a great evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, man, no problem. Take care.